Hey guys! Tonight, we are slipping quietly into the long, soot-dusted, slightly damp world of ordinary Victorian life, which is a polite way of saying a world where most people worked too hard, slept too little, washed under protest, and were expected to be grateful that at least civilization had provided them with chimney smoke. So, before we settle in among the narrow streets, hard mattresses, and suspicious stews of the 19th century, please remember to quietly subscribe if you enjoy this kind of sleepy history. It helps the channel, and unlike many Victorian jobs, it does not require losing a finger in a textile mill. Now, when people hear the phrase Victorian England, they often imagine velvet curtains, silver tea services, stern ladies with impossible hairstyles, and gentlemen looking disapprovingly at soup. But that was not ordinary life for most Victorians. Ordinary Victorians were not gliding elegantly through candlelit drawing rooms discussing poetry and inheritance. They were trying to stay warm, trying to keep food on the table, trying to avoid disease, trying to survive factory schedules that treated the human body as an inconvenient attachment to labor, and trying in general to get through the week without the house collapsing, the baby catching something terrible, or the rent collector arriving with the expression of a man who had never once been impressed by excuses. The Victorian age stretched through most of the 19th century during the reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901, and it was an age of industry, empire, invention, urban growth, reform, and a truly remarkable amount of grime. Railways spread, factories expanded, cities swelled, and people spoke with tremendous confidence about progress, which was useful because progress often looked a great deal more attractive in speeches than it did in the alley behind your lodging. For millions of ordinary people, especially in industrial towns, life meant long hours, unstable income, cramped housing, polluted air, and a constant awareness that one illness, one injury, or one bad week at work could push a family from hardship into disaster with almost no warning. And yet, people still married, raised children, gossiped, celebrated holidays, told jokes, attended church, mended clothes, borrowed money, drank tea, argued with neighbors, and tried to carve out some dignity in lives that were neither glamorous nor easy. If you were an ordinary Victorian laborer, clerk, seamstress, servant, hawker, dock worker, laundress, maid-of-all-work, porter, charwoman, or factory hand, your day usually began early because 19th century life had almost no interest in the modern notion that a person might need rest in order to function like a human being. In many working-class homes, people rose before dawn, especially in winter, when the morning was black, cold, and almost offensively unwilling to become day. Lighting cost money. Heating cost money. Food cost money. Time itself felt expensive. If you worked in a factory, a workshop, or domestic service, lateness could mean lost wages or punishment. And since wages were already precarious, that was not a minor concern. Homes themselves were often crowded. In poorer urban areas, whole families might live in one or two rooms. Sometimes lodgers shared the space as well because an extra body paying a little rent could make the difference between scraping by and not scraping by. Privacy, therefore, was not one of the great Victorian luxuries for the poor. You slept, dressed, argued, ate, coughed, worried, and aged within inches of other people. Beds might be shared by siblings, by parents and children, or by whoever could fit. Mattresses could be stuffed with straw or flock, which sounds rustic until you imagine the dust, the damp, the insects, and the persistent suspicion that the bed itself has a social life of its own. In very poor lodging houses, the situation could be worse. There were beds rented by the night, spaces rented by the hour, and in some especially miserable places, even ropes stretched across rooms that allowed people to sleep, leaning over them, which is both innovative and insulting at the same time. Washing in the morning was limited by water, time, and the general fact that Victorian plumbing was nowhere near as enthusiastic about cleanliness as Victorian moralists were. Many homes had no indoor plumbing at all. Water had to be fetched from a pump, brought inside, heated if possible, and used sparingly. A full bath was not an everyday event for ordinary people. More often, there was a basin, a cloth, and a practical decision about which bits of the body were most in need of attention. Even then, soap cost money, hot water required fuel, privacy was scarce, and houses were cold. So hygiene existed, but often in a negotiated form that modern people would classify as trying their best under regrettable conditions. Clothing was worn repeatedly, mended frequently, and washed laboriously. Laundry itself was exhausting. It involved hauling water, heating it, scrubbing garments by hand, wringing them out, boiling some items, battling soot, grease, and human reality, then hanging everything to dry in a climate that did not always seem emotionally committed to drying anything. Breakfast, if there was time and money, was plain. Bread was common. Tea became central to British daily life because it was warm, stimulating, and, with sugar if one could afford it, comforting in a way that suggested civilization had not completely given up. Porridge, dripping on bread, maybe a little bacon, if the household was doing surprisingly well, perhaps leftovers, perhaps nothing substantial at all. The Victorian poor did not starve every day in the dramatic literary sense, but undernourishment was common, and diets were often monotonous. Bread, potatoes, cheap fats, tea, sometimes cheese, sometimes bits of meat, often more starch than nutrition. Fresh fruit and vegetables could be seasonal, expensive, or difficult to keep. Milk was not always pure. Bread could be adulterated. Food quality was an ongoing issue in urban markets where sellers and buyers both understood that survival did not always leave room for ideal standards. There is something deeply Victorian about living in the age of industrial triumph while wondering whether your milk contains enough actual milk to be worth discussing. If you were a factory worker, the journey to work might take you through streets lined with smoke-blackened buildings, open drains, piles of refuse, animals, carts, shouting vendors, and enough mud to give the whole city the texture of a badly considered pudding. Industrial cities like Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, and parts of London grew rapidly, and growth did not automatically come with sanitation, planning, or a generous regard for lungs. Smoke from coal fires and factories darkened buildings and air alike. In some districts, the sky itself seemed to have entered a permanent working arrangement with soot. This was not merely untidy. It affected health, visibility, clothing, and the general mood of being alive. Respiratory illness was common. Water sources were contaminated. Disease moved efficiently through crowded districts. Cholera outbreaks in the 19th century terrified cities, not least because they revealed in awful clarity how filth, bad drainage, and contaminated water could kill entire neighborhoods. Typhus, tuberculosis, scarlet fever, smallpox, measles, diarrhea, influenza, and a whole grim chorus of infections formed the background music of ordinary life. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly high. Many parents lost children. Many children lost siblings. Many adults did not reach old age. The Victorians spoke often of duty and respectability, but under that language was constant exposure to loss. Work was the center of life for most ordinary Victorians, and it came in many forms, none of them especially interested in work-life balance. Factory labor could mean cotton mills, weaving sheds, match factories, pottery works, metal trades, docks, mines, brickworks, or countless smaller workshops where bodies were spent in exchange for wages that were necessary and rarely generous. Hours were long. 10 or 12 hours a day was not unusual, and in earlier parts of the century more could be demanded. Reforms came over time, especially regarding children and women in some industries, but regulation was uneven and the pressure of poverty was relentless. If you needed wages, principle could not be eaten. Factory environments were loud, dangerous, and exhausting. Machinery did not pause because a worker was tired, distracted, or growing old. Injuries were common. Fingers, hands, scalps, limbs, sight, hearing, lungs, and backs could all be damaged by industrial work. Dust filled the air in textile mills. In mining communities, danger came underground from collapse, gas, flooding, explosions, and the slow ruin of the chest. Men, women, and children all worked, especially in poorer households. Child labor remains one of the most haunting parts of ordinary Victorian life because it reveals how economic need could turn childhood into a job description. Children worked in mills, mines, workshops, streets, and homes. Some sold flowers, matches, or newspapers. Some worked as chimney sweeps, a profession whose combination of soot, claustrophobia, and child endangerment really should have disqualified it from respectable society much sooner than it did. Reformers eventually campaigned against many of these abuses, and laws gradually limited the hours and conditions under which children could work. But for much of this century, poor families relied on every member to contribute. Schooling existed, and education expanded over the century, but attendance could be inconsistent when wages were needed. An ordinary Victorian child might spend part of life in school and part at work, acquiring literacy alongside exhaustion. And if you were a girl, your future options were often narrower, though not less demanding. Girls might enter domestic service, sewing, laundry, or factory work. Boys might apprentice, labor, haul, carry, sweep, or run errands. Either way, the romance of childhood had a tendency to disappear in the face of rent. Domestic service was one of the largest sources of employment for women, and it had its own particular miseries. A housemaid, kitchen maid, scullery maid, nursemaid, cook, laundry maid, or maid of all work lived in the employer's house, which meant food and lodging, but also surveillance, hierarchy, endless labor, and time that was never fully your own. Servants rose early, worked late, and were expected to be respectful, efficient, unobtrusive, and somehow always available. In large houses, the staff hierarchy could be as intricate as a military campaign. In smaller middle-class homes, one servant might do nearly everything: scrubbing floors, carrying coal, emptying chamber pots, blacking grates, cleaning boots, making fires, washing dishes, hauling water, serving meals, minding children, and looking invisible while doing all of it required a level of stamina that would have impressed Roman engineers. Days off were limited, Employers could be kind, indifferent, exacting, or tyrannical. References mattered. A lost place could mean homelessness. And because service placed working-class women inside middle-class homes, it also put them in close contact with ideals of gentility that they were expected to support but not share. It is one of history's quieter jokes that many respectable households depended entirely on the labor of women they barely wished to notice. For working-class men, labor identity mattered deeply. Masculinity was tied to earning, endurance, and the ability to support a family, even when wages made that nearly impossible. Casual labor, especially in docks and day work, was precarious. Men might gather each morning hoping to be selected for work. If chosen, the day brought money and exhaustion. If not chosen, there was worry, humiliation, and another argument with arithmetic at home. Skilled trades offered somewhat better prospects, though not immunity from downturns. Artisans could take pride in craft, but industrialization increasingly altered production, wages, and independence. Clerks occupied a different but still ordinary layer of Victorian society. Lower middle-class men in offices, shops, railways, warehouses, and counting houses. Their work was cleaner than factory labor, but often poorly paid, sedentary, and anxious. Respectability mattered intensely here. A clerk had to dress correctly, write well, remain sober, appear trustworthy, and maintain the look of gentility even when the salary behind it was alarmingly thin. The black coat, careful handwriting, and polished manners concealed a constant fear of slipping downward. Victorian society loved respectability because it allowed people to judge one another using hats. The home, in theory, was supposed to be the moral center of life. In practice, for ordinary Victorians, it was also a workplace, nursery, dining room, sick room, laundry, and negotiation chamber. Women's domestic labor held households together. Married working-class women often managed budgets that would have made army quartermasters quietly weep. They stretched food, mended clothes, fetched water, cooked over unreliable fires, cleaned rooms that dirt seemed magnetically attached to, cared for children, nursed the sick, and sometimes took in washing, sewing, charring, or lodgers to supplement income. The Victorian ideal of the angel in the house was written largely for middle-class audiences with enough furniture to support the metaphor. For poor women, domestic virtue involved survival skills, not decorative serenity. Pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous. Repeated pregnancies were common. Contraception existed in limited and often stigmatized forms, but information and access varied widely. Maternal mortality remained a serious risk, so did postpartum illness, infection, and sheer depletion. And then there was the ceaseless work of caring for children in environments full of hazards, contaminated water, poor housing, infectious disease, open fires, bad air, and streets that could injure or swallow the unwatched child with equal enthusiasm. Meals across the day were shaped by money, availability, and habit. Dinner, meaning the main meal, often came when work allowed. Stew, bread, potatoes, onions, bits of meat, bacon, herring, pies, puddings, broth, and tea formed parts of ordinary diets. Beer was common, too, partly because water could be unsafe, and partly because laboring populations have historically appreciated a drink after being treated like movable machinery. Gin retained an uneasy reputation from earlier urban drinking culture, while beer and porter sat more comfortably within daily life. Public houses played a major role in male sociability, business, gossip, and temporary relief, from domestic crowding. They also drew moral criticism from reformers who worried, not always wrongly, that drink consumed money families needed. Yet the pub was not merely a den of vice. It was a social center, warm, lit, and often more pleasant than home. One can see the problem immediately. If your home is cold and cramped, and the pub is warm and full of other people willing to argue about politics, empire, football, wages, or nothing at all, the sermon against drink must work considerably harder. Religion shaped Victorian life deeply, though not uniformly. Church-going varied by class, region, and denomination, but religion infused public morality, charity, schooling, and ideas of proper behavior. The Church of England was established, but nonconformist groups, such as Methodists, Baptists, and others, had strong presences, particularly among parts of the working and lower middle classes. Catholic communities, especially in Ireland and among Irish migrants in Britain, faced suspicion and prejudice. Sermons, Sunday schools, missions, temperance societies, and charitable organizations formed part of everyday social life. Religion provided comfort, community, moral language, and sometimes practical support. It also supplied a great deal of advice, not all of it requested, on drinking, sexuality, cleanliness, obedience, and the correct way to endure misery without making too much of a scene. Sundays were different from weekdays. Work might pause, though not for everyone. Families dressed in their best clothes if they had such things. Church attendance, visiting, rest, reading, and slightly better meals might mark the day. For some, Sunday was genuinely peaceful. For others, it was mainly quieter poverty, with improved collars. Leisure for ordinary Victorians existed, but it was limited by time, money, and the stern suspicion among reformers that enjoyment could easily turn into sin if left unsupervised. Still, people found amusement. Music halls became immensely popular by the later 19th century, offering songs, comic routines, sketches, and lively entertainment that middle-class critics often disapproved of in exactly the way that guarantees success. Penny gaffes, fairs, street performers, cheap theaters, pleasure gardens, public parks, football matches, cricket, excursions by train, seaside trips, reading cheap fiction, listening to ballads, and simply visiting friends or relatives all mattered. Children played in streets, yards, and alleys with improvised toys, games, marbles, hoops, skipping ropes, and an apparent ability to invent fun in places adults would classify as municipal despair. Reading expanded over the century as literacy grew and cheap print spread. Newspapers, serialized novels, pamphlets, chapbooks, almanacs, and penny dreadfuls reached wide audiences. This meant that even ordinary Victorians living on very little could participate in a broader culture of news, scandal, crime, politics, and fiction. One of the fascinating features of the age is how morally serious it liked to sound while absolutely devouring sensational material. Respectable society frowned, then leaned closer. Courtship and marriage among ordinary Victorians were shaped by community, work, money, and the simple fact that romance is more complicated when you share walls with 6 relatives and a lodger who snores like a legal dispute. People met through neighborhoods, churches, work, kin networks, or service. Courtship could be affectionate, practical, hopeful, and constrained all at once. Marriage rates rose and fell with economic conditions because men were often expected to be able to support a household before marrying, at least in theory. In practice, many couples married with very little, because waiting for financial security may have seemed like waiting for a comet to pay rent. Weddings varied from modest church ceremonies to small family celebrations. Rings were not universal early on among the poor. Feasting depended on means. And then came married life, which might hold tenderness, strain, babies, debt, cooperation, resentment, and relentless work. Domestic violence existed, as it always has, though the law and social attitudes often failed women badly. Desertion happened. Widowhood happened. Illness happened, yet mutual support mattered too. Many working-class marriages functioned as practical partnerships held together by shared labor and stubbornness. Death was close in Victorian life. Not necessarily dramatic death with orchestras and final speeches, but ordinary death. The child who does not survive winter, the mother who dies in childbirth, the father worn down by labor, the grandmother gone after a fever, the baby whose name is still on the family's lips when the next rent is due. Mourning customs became elaborate in some circles, especially middle-class ones, but grief itself crossed class lines. Funerals could be expensive. Burial clubs and friendly societies helped some families manage costs. Cemeteries expanded as urban populations grew. Black clothing, mourning jewelry, memorial cards, and rituals of remembrance all took shape within a culture that knew mortality very well. Queen Victoria's own prolonged mourning after Prince Albert's death helped establish wider mourning fashions, but the poor did not need royal example to understand loss. They were already experts. Health care for ordinary Victorians was uneven, improvised, and frequently alarming. Doctors existed, of course, but access depended on money, location, and trust. Hospitals were not always places people wanted to go, and for good reason. They could be associated with charity, surgery without adequate pain control in earlier decades, infection, and the acknowledgement that one was poor enough to need institutional help. Home remedies, patent medicines, pharmacists, midwives, neighbors' advice, folk traditions, and sheer endurance played huge roles in daily health. Patent medicines were often marketed with impressive confidence and variable usefulness. Some contained alcohol, opiates, or other ingredients that certainly made the patient feel different, which was then interpreted as a form of medical success. The 19th century did see major medical advances: anesthesia, antisepsis, improved public health understanding, vaccination, nursing reform associated with figures like Florence Nightingale, and eventually germ theory. But these developments reached ordinary lives gradually and unevenly. A working mother in a smoky alley did not suddenly enjoy modern medicine because somewhere a surgical innovation had been reported. Reform was real. So was delay. Education changed significantly across the Victorian period. Early in the century, schooling was patchy, often run by churches, charities, or fee-paying dame schools of variable quality. By the later 19th century, state involvement increased, elementary education expanded, and literacy rose. This was transformative. Reading and writing offered not just skill but possibility, better work, greater information, wider horizons, letters to distant relatives, newspapers, political awareness, and the ability to move within a society increasingly run on paper. Yet, schooling remained tied to discipline. Victorian classrooms could be strict, repetitive, and heavily moralized. Children learned lessons, hymns, copywork, sums, obedience, and the valuable civic principle that ink stains are apparently a sign of inner disorder. School boards compulsory attendance laws, and reformers all changed childhood, though not instantly. Many poor children still missed classes for work, illness, sibling care, or lack of boots. Boots, by the way, had an extraordinary ability to determine educational destiny in the 19th century. Politics touched ordinary Victorian life even when many ordinary people had little direct political power. Voting rights expanded gradually through Reform Acts in 1832, 1867, and 1884, increasing the male electorate step by step, though still not universally. Working men organized, petitioned, marched, joined unions, read radical papers, debated reform, and participated in political culture long before all could vote. Chartism in the mid-19th century was one of the great mass movements of the age, demanding political reform, including universal male suffrage. It frightened the establishment, inspired many workers, and demonstrated that ordinary people understood perfectly well that being governed without adequate representation was a tiresome habit of elite society. Trade unions grew too, though not without conflict and restriction. Strikes occurred. Employers resisted. Governments worried. Workers learned that collective action might win gains that individual endurance never would. Victorian Britain congratulated itself on liberty while frequently becoming nervous whenever laborers attempted to use it in groups. For the lower middle classes, life could be less physically punishing than for the urban poor, but no less anxious in its own way. Shopkeepers, school teachers, clerks, small businessmen, governesses, and skilled families clung to respectability with both hands, because a small fall could mean sliding into poverty, while a small rise might perhaps lead to better neighborhoods, a servant, or children in improved schools. Appearance mattered intensely. Clean cuffs, proper speech, decent furniture, manageable bills, upright behavior. Credit could sustain households, but also ruin them. Debt was common, shameful, and ordinary. The middle classes often defined themselves against the poor through discipline and appearance, yet many were economically fragile. You can almost hear the upholstery trembling with financial concern. Housing revealed class divisions in brick and damp. At the bottom were the slums, courts, cellars, rookeries, lodging houses, and overcrowded tenements of urban poverty where drainage was bad, ventilation poor, water inadequate, and disease abundant. Reformers documented these conditions with horror, sometimes mixed with a tone suggesting they had only just discovered that the poor existed in quantity. Above this were modest working-class terraces, often two-up, two-down houses with small yards, shared privies, and little space, but perhaps some stability if wages held. Then came more comfortable homes for skilled workers or the respectable lower middle class, with parlors, better furniture, and stronger claims to gentility. The Victorian house was a moral symbol as much as a shelter. A clean doorstep, lace curtain, or polished hearth could signal order, self-respect, and ambition. Working-class wives in particular were judged by the condition of the home, even when overcrowding, poor sanitation, and exhaustion made cleanliness an act of near-heroic persistence. Migration also shaped ordinary life. Rural people moved to towns. Irish migrants, especially during and after the Great Famine, settled in British cities and often faced hostility, poverty, and overcrowded conditions. Families were uprooted by labor demand, enclosure, mechanization, and the lure or necessity of urban wages. The village world of agricultural rhythms did not vanish. But industrial and urban life altered the social landscape profoundly. For those who stayed in rural areas, ordinary life was hardly idyllic. Agricultural laborers worked hard for low pay, often seasonally, under landowners and farmers who did not routinely mistake generosity for policy. Rural cottages could be poor, wages low, and opportunities limited. Domestic service drew many young women out of the countryside. Railways, newspapers, and markets connected rural communities more closely to the wider world, but village poverty remained real. The Victorian countryside only looks peaceful if you stand at the correct distance and avoid asking who is hungry. Empire hovered over ordinary Victorian life in curious ways. Many people consumed goods made possible by imperial trade: tea, sugar, tobacco, cotton. Soldiers, sailors, clerks, missionaries, and emigrants connected Britain to colonies and dominions. News from India, Africa, Australia, Canada, and elsewhere entered newspapers and public discussion. Yet most ordinary Victorians experienced empire less as direct power and more as background assumption, patriotic display, commodity flow, and occasional military excitement. It was the grand project discussed in Parliament and newspapers, while ordinary families worried about coal, rent, boots, and influenza. Still, imperial ideology seeped into education, entertainment, religion, and ideas of national identity. The nation was proud. The alley remained damp. Seasonal rhythms shaped life too. Winter was hard. Cold rooms, expensive fuel, illness, short days, and unemployment in some trades. Summer brought heat in crowded cities, foul smells from drains and refuse, and sometimes seasonal work. Holidays such as Christmas became more elaborately celebrated over the century, especially under the influence of new commercial culture, revived traditions, and royal example. For ordinary families, Christmas might mean church, pudding, small gifts, greenery, better food if possible, games, singing, and a brief pause in hardship. Not everyone had Dickensian warmth, but the ideal of family festivity became increasingly powerful. It is one of the Victorian era's most durable gifts, the insistence that winter can be made sentimental with enough candles and printed illustrations. Crime and policing also entered daily life differently as the century progressed. The creation of modern police forces changed urban order, not always to universal delight. Some working-class communities initially distrusted police, seeing them as agents of authority rather than guardians of fairness, which was often a realistic assessment. Petty theft, drunkenness, assault, prostitution, fraud, vagrancy, and disorder filled court records. For the poor, legal trouble could arise not only from serious crime, but from the criminalization of poverty itself. Workhouses loomed as the dreaded solution for those unable to support themselves. Under the new Poor Law in England and Wales from 1834 onward, relief was increasingly tied to the workhouse, deliberately designed to be unpleasant, so that only the truly desperate would enter. This remains one of the more chilling administrative philosophies in modern history. Let us help the poor by terrifying them with institutional misery. Families could be separated inside workhouses. Conditions varied, but the stigma was severe. To fall into the workhouse was to lose independence publicly. Fear of that fate haunted many ordinary people, and yet they still formed communities. This is important. Victorian life for ordinary people was not simply a catalogue of suffering, though there was plenty of that. It was also a dense social world of neighborliness, quarrels, borrowing, lending, godparenting, gossip, shared childcare, local identity, humor, song, courtship, ritual, and mutual aid. Friendly societies offered insurance against sickness or burial costs. Neighbors watched children, sat with the dying, lent chairs for funerals, exchanged news, and kept informal economies alive. Women in particular sustained community networks through visits, errands, markets, churches, and endless practical cooperation. Crowded living meant conflict, naturally, but it also meant company. Loneliness existed, but isolation was harder to achieve. Everyone knew your business, sometimes before you did. So what was life like for ordinary Victorians? It was not the velvet version. It was disciplined by labor, narrowed by money, threatened by disease, and softened only in places by family affection, communal ties, religious faith, fleeting leisure, and the stubborn human habit of making life livable even when the age itself appears to have been designed by a committee of coal merchants, moral reformers, and men who considered ventilation a rumor. To be ordinary in Victorian Britain was to live inside transformation without being protected from its costs. Industry made fortunes, but it also made widows, cripples, and neighborhoods black with soot. Reform improved lives, but slowly, unevenly, and usually after a great many people had already suffered. Respectability gave dignity to some, shame to others, and work to nearly everyone, whether or not it paid well enough to justify the arrangement. Children grew up fast. Women carried impossible loads. Men aged early. Old age, if one reached it, could mean dependence, poverty, or the rare grace of family support. Yet, in the midst of all that, ordinary Victorians laughed, married, argued over tea, polished boots, courted on Sundays, read serialized fiction by dim light, saved coins in chipped cups, took pride in clean doorsteps, sang in chapels, watched parades, mourned their dead, and kept going with a steadiness that was less poetic than real. And perhaps that is the truest thing about them. They were not background figures in the age of steam. They were the age of steam, the bodies inside it, the lungs that breathed it, the hands that fed it, the feet that walked its muddy streets, the mothers who stretched its wages, the children it overworked, the fathers it wore down, the clerks who copied its numbers, the servants who kept its houses running, the laborers who built its railways, the patients who endured its diseases, and the voters, reformers, readers, workers, and mourners who slowly forced it to become something slightly less brutal than it had been. The Victorian age liked to call itself great. Ordinary Victorians, had they been less tired, might have asked for details, because greatness, from the viewpoint of an overworked seamstress squinting by weak light at midnight, is a difficult thing to admire in the abstract. And that seamstress, incidentally, was one of the most unmistakably Victorian figures of ordinary urban life. The woman who sewed for too long, earned too little, ruined her posture, damaged her eyesight, inhaled dust and fluff, and discovered that the age of progress had many beautiful things to say about commerce while remaining oddly vague on the subject of sitting down. Needlework, dressmaking, shirt-making, millinery, tailoring assistants, finishing work, and laundry all employed huge numbers of women in forms of labor that were sometimes done in workshops, sometimes in factories, and very often in cramped rooms at home. Piecework was especially brutal because payment depended on output, which meant speed, which meant fatigue, which meant mistakes, which meant less money, which meant more desperation, which meant still more work. It was an elegant system. if one enjoys elegance in the service of quiet exploitation. The same could be said of sweating, a labor arrangement in which workers, often women, completed subcontracted tasks for miserable pay and poor conditions. The phrase sweated labor was used by Victorians themselves, which is at least honest. They could occasionally name a horror correctly even while continuing to buy the blouse. Clothing mattered intensely in Victorian society because appearance communicated class, morality, respectability, ambition, and sometimes outright delusion. Ordinary people therefore spent precious money and immense effort on clothes that were expected to last. Garments were patched, altered, handed down, turned, recut, let out, taken in, darned, brushed, and made to survive with the stubbornness of elderly chairs. A respectable working man might own his everyday clothes and perhaps one better suit for Sundays or special occasions. A woman might treasure a shawl, bonnet, or better dress for church. Boots were repaired until they could fairly be said to exist on principle alone. Ready-made clothing became more available over the century, but custom second-hand markets and home sewing remained central. The poor bought old clothes because old clothes were what could be bought. Rag markets, pawnbrokers, and second-hand dealers were therefore woven into everyday existence. The pawnbroker in particular occupied a curious position, half lifeline, half judgment. Families pawned clothes, tools, household items, blankets, Sunday suits, and anything else not nailed down by sentiment, retrieving them when wages came in, if wages came in. The weekly rhythm of pawning and redeeming was so common in some places that it formed part of household economy. You might pawn a good coat on Monday and retrieve it by Saturday, if fortune had not taken one of its usual personal dislikes to you. This meant that clothing was not just worn. It was also financial strategy hanging from pegs. And through all this, ordinary Victorians lived under a social regime obsessed with reading moral worth from the cut of a sleeve or the cleanliness of a cuff. One of the colder habits of the 19th century was its faith that poverty could often be identified by a failure of character visible at a glance, which was convenient for everyone who preferred not to think structurally about wages. Streets themselves were workplaces for enormous numbers of people. If one walks imaginatively through an ordinary Victorian city, one does not encounter only factory hands and clerks heading dutifully toward fixed employment. One also encounters hawkers, peddlers, costermongers, flower sellers, match girls, crossing sweepers, knife grinders, organ grinders, ballad sellers, watercress girls, newspaper boys, mudlarks along the river, porters hauling goods, and casual laborers waiting for chance. The street economy was loud, inventive, unstable, and very often family-based. Costermongers sold fruit, vegetables, fish, shellfish, cheap goods, or whatever could be obtained and moved quickly enough to become money before rot or police interference set in. Their carts and barrows were familiar sights in London and other cities. They shouted, joked, argued, competed, and developed reputations in neighborhoods that depended on them more than respectable critics admitted. Street markets provided cheaper food and flexible access for people without time or money for proper shops. They were also socially important, full of gossip, bargaining, and the endless urban theater of people watching one another survive. Respectable observers frequently described these scenes with fascination mixed with alarm, as though they had discovered that the poor did not spend all day silently regretting themselves, but instead had voices, jokes, preferences, and commerce. The relationship between ordinary Victorians and authority was therefore constant and rarely warm. Police, inspectors, landlords, foremen, relieving officers, school attendance officers, magistrates, employers, and charitable ladies with notebooks all had opinions about how the poor ought to behave. Sometimes intervention improved conditions. Public health inspectors helped expose dangerous housing and sanitation failures. Factory inspectors, when active and empowered, sometimes reduced abuses. School reforms did broaden opportunity. Yet ordinary people also learned that being watched from above often meant being corrected rather than helped. Victorian society loved improvement, particularly when someone else had to do the improving. Nowhere was this more visible than in philanthropy and charitable reform. The 19th century produced a great many earnest people determined to save the poor from drink, idleness, ignorance, vice, dirt, and occasionally even from starvation. Some did real good. Ragged schools educated children who otherwise had little chance. Settlement workers, mission staff, nurses, reformers, and campaigners sometimes transformed neighborhoods or at least relieved suffering. Octavia Hill improved housing management for some tenants. Dr. Barnardo worked with destitute children. Social investigators drew attention to appalling urban conditions. Yet charity often came bundled with moral inspection. To receive help could mean being measured for deservingness, sobriety, thrift, cleanliness, gratitude, and correct domestic arrangements. The poor were expected not merely to need assistance, but to perform the right kind of need. It was never enough to be miserable. One had to be miserable in a manner acceptable to committee members. Education in this world was therefore not only about reading and arithmetic, but about discipline and social control. Board schools later in the century, Sunday schools, church schools, industrial schools, reformatories, and ragged schools all transmitted habits as much as knowledge. Children learned punctuality, obedience, cleanliness, patriotism, scripture, penmanship, and the strange Victorian belief that sitting very straight might solve broader social disorder. Schoolrooms could be overcrowded, underheated, badly ventilated, and ruled by teachers whose patience had been worn down by numbers, pay, and the fact that human children refused to behave like neatly stacked ledgers. Yet literacy really did open doors. Letters connected families separated by migration. Newspapers gave workers access to politics and crime reporting. Cheap fiction offered escape. Self-improvement literature promised advancement, or at least a more refined vocabulary with which to describe disappointment. Mechanics' institutes, lecture halls, reading rooms, and circulating libraries expanded the intellectual world for some ordinary men and women, especially among the respectable working and lower middle classes. The Victorians were serious readers because print had become cheaper, more available, and deeply entangled with aspirations of improvement. They were also enthusiastic readers of murder, scandal, ghost stories, and melodrama, because self-improvement is exhausting without a little blood on the side. Railway travel changed ordinary life in ways both grand and humble. By the mid and late 19th century, railways connected cities, towns, industrial districts, ports, and seaside resorts with an efficiency earlier generations would have regarded as suspiciously magical. For ordinary Victorians, this meant more than engineering triumph. it meant mobility. Goods moved faster, newspapers traveled farther, fish reached inland markets, relatives became easier to visit, workers could travel for jobs, and excursions became possible for people who had never before imagined leaving their local district except under compulsion. Cheap excursion trains enabled day trips to the seaside or countryside. Holiday making, though still limited and unequal, became more imaginable for working people. This was not trivial. To stand at the sea after months in a smoky city and realize that the horizon did not smell like drain water must have felt almost theological. Seaside towns grew in popularity, each offering its own mixture of health claims, promenades, lodging houses, shellfish, donkeys, wind, and the chance to pretend for one day that life was not organized entirely around coal. Yet even leisure by the sea was often structured by class. The middle classes promenaded with more confidence and more luggage. Working people came on excursions packed in, cheerful, tired, determined to squeeze value from every hour. Photographs, postcards, souvenirs, bathing machines, and railway timetables all became part of this changing culture. Even time itself became more standardized under railway schedules, which is a very Victorian achievement, taking a vast country of local habits and persuading it to synchronize its clocks because trains had no patience for regional whimsy. For ordinary urban families, however, most days still unfolded at neighborhood scale. The butcher, baker, beer house, chandler, pawnbroker, chemist, greengrocer, school, mission hall, church, public pump, and pub formed the loved geography of routine. Sound carried through walls, smells rose from yards. Window cleaning, sweeping, gossiping, quarreling, singing, crying babies, hawkers' calls, clattering carts, church bells, factory whistles, and drunk men returning late stitched together the soundtrack of daily existence. Nights in Victorian cities were not uniformly dark once gaslighting spread, but darkness remained a real presence in poorer districts and side streets. Gas lamps illuminated major thoroughfares and respectable areas more reliably than courts and alleys. Artificial light extended working hours, evening sociability, shopping, and public entertainment, but also reminded everyone that light itself was a paid commodity. A bright shop front was a statement. A dim home was arithmetic. The experience of night varied sharply by class, gender, and occupation. For a clerk returning home, night might mean weary relief. Supper, perhaps reading, perhaps a short walk. For a servant, it might mean more chores after the family had gone to bed. For a policeman, night meant patrol, watchfulness, and paperwork. For a prostitute, it meant work in danger. For the homeless, it meant finding shelter, dodging authorities, and surviving cold. For the sick, it meant coughing, fever, worry, and perhaps the long sound of a church clock marking hours no one had asked for. Prostitution was one of the stark realities of Victorian urban life, and one that respectable society discussed with a mix of horror, obsession, and hypocrisy elaborate enough to qualify as civic architecture. Women entered prostitution for many reasons: low wages, abandonment, widowhood, abuse, lack of other employment, survival. Some moved in and out of it. Some combined it with domestic service or casual labor. Some were drawn into it very young. The public narrative often framed fallen women as moral warning signs, while the demand sustaining prostitution was treated with much softer analytical attention when it came to men. Rescue homes, moral campaigns, sensational journalism, and disease legislation all reflected this imbalance. The Contagious Diseases Acts, for instance, subjected women suspected of prostitution in certain districts to invasive medical examinations, while male clients remained conveniently less troubled by state morality. Victorian society did not merely maintain double standards, it polished them. Ordinary women who remained outside prostitution still lived under constant scrutiny regarding sexual respectability, reputation, and chastity. A lost character could cost employment, marriage prospects, housing, and safety. Servants could be dismissed if pregnant. Single mothers faced ferocious stigma and economic precarity. Illegitimacy carried legal and social consequences that children then had the courtesy to bear despite not having arranged the matter. And yet people loved, desired, made mistakes, formed attachments, had affairs, eloped, concealed relationships, and behaved in all the usual human ways beneath layers of moral rhetoric. The Victorians did not invent hypocrisy, but they did give it better furniture. Marriage law and family law changed over the century, though not always quickly enough to comfort those trapped before reform. Early Victorian married women had extremely limited property rights under coverture, which meant a wife's legal identity was largely absorbed into that of her husband. Later reforms, including the Married Women's Property Acts, gradually improved this, allowing women to retain property and earnings in ways that had previously been denied. Divorce was possible but costly, difficult, and deeply scandalous for much of the century, making it largely inaccessible to ordinary people. Separation happened informally. Desertion happened practically. Endurance, again, was cheaper than legal remedy. Working-class families also had their own informal customs and economies within marriage. Women often managed day-to-day spending, stretching wages through tactics so refined they amounted to fiscal engineering conducted beside a wash tub. Saving clubs, burial clubs, pawned cycles, neighborly borrowing, and small side earnings created fragile systems of resilience. A husband's wages might disappear through unemployment, drink, injury, or premature death, and households had to improvise. Widows sometimes took in lodgers, ran tiny businesses, washed clothes, kept shops, sold food, charred, or relied on older children's earnings. Widowhood could bring a painful mix of grief and terrifying paperwork. Old age among ordinary Victorians is often overlooked because the period feels so crowded with factories, reform acts, and serious whiskers that one forgets some people actually grew old inside it. Those who did often faced insecurity. Before state pensions at the very end of the era and beyond, old age without savings or family support could mean dependency on children, parish relief, charity, workhouse assistance, or continued labor for as long as the body allowed. Elderly women might nurse grandchildren, mend clothes, do light charring, or simply occupy a chair with the authority of someone who had seen enough nonsense to stop commenting. Elderly men might continue casual tasks, small trading, gardening, or doorkeeping, if possible. Intergenerational households were not uncommon, partly from necessity. Grandparents, widowed relatives, unmarried siblings, and lodgers could all be woven into domestic arrangements. This produced care, tension, affection, and arguments about teapots in equal measure. The Victorian family was not a tidy little unit around a table unless the illustrator had been paid by the page. It was usually a practical coalition. Food, again, deserves more than a passing glance, because ordinary life is built from recurring meals more than from speeches by important men. A great deal of Victorian food was plain, filling, repetitive, and dependent on local supply. Bread remained central. Potatoes were crucial. Bacon, cheese, onions, herrings, eels, pies, puddings, broths, offal, sweet, treacle, pickles, and tea formed a pattern of cheap sustenance. Offal mattered not because Victorians were culinary romantics, but because animals had to be used fully and poor households could not afford selectivity. Tripe, liver, kidneys, hearts, trotters, and other less fashionable cuts fed people in cities where meat, when available, was a luxury best approached with realism. Street food had its place, too. Baked potatoes, pies, shellfish, fried fish later in the century, coffee stalls, and other quick, cheap meals for people with limited facilities or time. Industrialization altered food supply enormously. Railways improved transport. Canning and new preservation methods slowly expanded possibilities. Imported foods increased. Urban markets grew. Yet adulteration remained a notorious problem until regulation improved. Chalk and flour, water and milk, sand and sugar, tea, reused or colored, dangerous dyes and sweets, and all manner of creative tampering turned shopping into a relationship of hope rather than certainty. A Victorian mother buying food sometimes had to trust a system that clearly regarded chemistry as an entrepreneurial opportunity. Public health reforms in the later century did make significant differences. This deserves emphasis, because the Victorian story is not only one of misery, but of fierce argument, followed by gradual collective improvement. Sewer construction, cleaner water supplies, better drainage, refuse removal, housing reform efforts, vaccination programs, and local government action all helped reduce the burden of disease over time. Figures like Edwin Chadwick, John Snow, Joseph Bazalgette, and many local reformers contributed to changing urban conditions, though their motives, methods, and politics varied. The famous connection between contaminated water and cholera was not simply a medical curiosity. It was a revelation that cities could kill by design, and therefore might be saved by design. Bazalgette's London sewers, for example, were monumental infrastructure shaped partly by the Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames became so foul in summer that Parliament itself struggled to ignore what the poor had been smelling for years. It is one of history's useful patterns. Reform accelerates the moment discomfort reaches influential nostrils. Even with improvements, however, ordinary bodies bore the marks of hard living. Working people aged quickly. Teeth were often poor. Malnutrition affected growth. Occupational diseases scarred lungs, backs, joints, and skin. Skin infections, lice, digestive illness, rheumatism, and chronic pain were not special tragedies, but recurring conditions of being alive. Dentistry for the poor was closer to extraction than care. Eye problems, hearing loss, and untreated injuries accumulated, yet life was not one uninterrupted groan. People took pride in appearance, in the cleanliness of a room, in a Sunday outing, in a child learning to read, in a savings club account, in a flower, in a cracked pot, in a bird kept in a cage, in a brass ornament polished until it seemed far more expensive than it had any right to be. Respectability was sometimes oppressive, but it could also be aspirational in an understandable way. To keep a neat home or dress a child well was a declaration that hardship had not swallowed self-respect whole. Working-class culture included music, storytelling, jokes, local sayings, songs, superstitions, and forms of mutual aid the official record often underestimates. Women swapped remedies and recipes. Men traded labor leads and political arguments. Children invented games from almost nothing. Friendly societies provided insurance-like support for sickness and funerals. Trade clubs and unions fostered solidarity. Chapels and pubs each created communities of different kinds. There were holiday customs, fair days, wakes, outings, and neighborhood rituals. Even within cities, distinct districts developed identities, loyalties, rivalries, and reputations. Speech marked class powerfully, too. Accent, vocabulary, grammar, and manners could open or close opportunities. A clerk learned one voice for the office and another for home. A servant had to sound respectful without becoming invisible. A child in school could be corrected for speech that identified family origins. Standard English functioned not just as language, but as a gatekeeping device. Meanwhile, the rich romanticized the people in songs and novels, while remaining careful not to sit too near them on trains. Domestic interiors reveal perhaps more than any statistic how ordinary Victorians lived. Picture the room of a respectable working-class family in the later 19th century, maybe a small front room kept for best if there were enough rooms to permit such luxury, maybe just a kitchen living space where most life occurred. A table, chairs, perhaps a dresser with crockery, maybe a clock if fortune had smiled unusually hard, a fire grate blacked and polished, perhaps pictures on the wall, maybe Bible texts, maybe family photographs later in the century, maybe artificial flowers under glass, maybe a few treasured books, bedrooms upstairs if the house allowed, children crammed together, parents in one bed, air heavy from bodies, damp, and the memory of coal smoke. Chamber pots, under beds, washstands if the family was doing well, pegs for clothes, drawers or boxes for linen, and the small hoardings of life. In poorer homes, there was less. Fewer chairs, fewer rooms, less privacy, less bedding, more strain. But even then, people arranged objects carefully. They cleaned what could be cleaned. They displayed what little they had. A polished mantel or scrubbed doorstep carried emotional weight because order was a defense against humiliation. This helps explain why Victorian moralists were so fixated on domestic tidiness. They sensed, correctly, that the home was a battlefield of meaning. They simply failed, rather often, to notice that clean floors are harder to maintain when 8 people share 2 rooms and one of them has bronchitis. For children, ordinary Victorian life was a strange mixture of play, labor, discipline, illness, and noise. A child might run errands, mind younger siblings, fetch water, attend school irregularly, work part-time, play in the street, learn hymns, fear the cane, collect bits of string and nothing of obvious value, and be sent to bed early because candles cost money. Toys varied by class, but many games required little equipment: tag, skipping, marbles, spinning tops, hoops, chalk games, improvised dolls, toy soldiers, pebbles, sticks, songs, and imagination. Childhood was more physically independent in some ways. Children roamed neighborhoods, encountered markets, traffic, animals, workspaces, and hazards modern parents would classify as catastrophic. Yet they were also closely tied to family economies. A child was rarely treated as a creature whose purpose was self-discovery. A child was a dependent person expected to become useful quickly. Sentimental ideas of childhood certainly existed and expanded, especially in middle-class culture literature, and education reform. But poverty had a way of editing sentiment for practical use. Adolescence, as a distinct protected phase, was a luxury many did not receive. By 13 or 14, many were already in service. Factory labor, apprenticeships, shop work, or domestic duties heavy enough to count as adulthood in everything but law. Courtship among the working and lower middle classes therefore often took shape in compressed lives. Walking out together on Sundays, meeting after chapel, talking on doorsteps, writing short letters, exchanging small gifts, attending fairs or music halls, saving for marriage, negotiating parents' opinions, and worrying over wages all formed part of ordinary romance. There was tenderness in Victorian life, certainly, but it generally had to occur around other people and under financial pressure. That is perhaps why so much of it seems practical rather than theatrical. To choose one another in a period of instability was itself a kind of brave administrative act. The later Victorian period also saw the growth of organized recreation, especially for men and boys. Football clubs, cricket, cycling, pigeon fancying, brass bands, mutual improvement societies, allotments, volunteer corps, temperance groups, choirs, debating societies, and excursions all gave structure to leisure. Working hours in some industries gradually shortened. Saturday half-holidays appeared for some workers, and towns developed parks and public spaces. Public parks were important democratic landscapes, even if heavily regulated. They offered air, greenery, walking space, and the novel experience of being allowed decorative grass nearby under conditions. Parks, museums, libraries, and exhibitions all reflected a Victorian faith that public culture could civilize the masses, though ordinary people also used these spaces simply because sitting in clean surroundings without paying much was pleasant. Music halls deserve another look because they reveal an ordinary Victorian appetite for laughter against all logic. Performers sang comic songs, sentimental ballads, topical numbers, patriotic pieces, and songs full of innuendo everyone understood while pretending not to. Audiences drank, shouted, joined in choruses, and embraced entertainment that was noisy, emotional, and communal. Moral reformers often hated music halls for precisely the reasons audiences loved them. They were not quiet, improving, or deferential. They were alive. Alongside them existed cheap theaters, melodramas, pantomimes, circuses, waxworks, freak shows, panoramas, lectures, and exhibitions. The Victorian entertainment industry knew perfectly well that ordinary people who had worked all week might not crave a lecture on self-denial. They might instead prefer a comic song about a landlady or a villain falling through a trapdoor. The rise of mass newspapers intensified the shared culture. Crime reporting, serialized novels, imperial wars, royal news, local politics, labor disputes, sports results, and advertising all entered homes and workplaces through print. Advertising itself became more visible and aggressive, persuading ordinary people to purchase soaps, tonics, pills, corsets, boots, tea, cocoa, blacking, household products, and miracle treatments. Modern consumer culture was growing inside Victorian Britain, and ordinary families encountered it with a mixture of desire, skepticism, and budgetary despair. Shop windows displayed goods with increasing sophistication. Department stores emerged for those who could afford them. Mail-order possibilities slowly expanded, yet for most people, consumption remained constrained. Looking was free. Owning was arithmetic. The state's presence in ordinary life also widened over the century through registration, schooling, sanitation, policing, postal systems, taxation, census-taking, public works, and legal reform. Births, marriages, and deaths were registered. Census enumerators asked questions. Boards and councils made rules. The post became a central national artery, allowing cheap letters and later parcels to move widely. Postal savings banks encouraged thrift. Stamps, forms, official notices, and bureaucratic categories slowly extended government into everyday routine. This did not necessarily feel comforting. It often felt like more paper. But it also created a more interconnected society. A working man could read a newspaper from another town, send a letter across the country, travel by train, buy goods transported from far away, vote if enfranchised, join a national union, and consume imperial commodities at breakfast. Ordinary life was still local, but it was increasingly threaded into wider systems. And then there was weather, that eternal collaborator with discomfort. Victorian homes for the ordinary population were rarely easy climates. Winter cold seeped through walls, floors, and blankets. Fires had to be fed with coal or other fuel, which cost money. Damp worsened coughs and made bedding miserable. Frost inside windows was not unheard of. Summer heat in urban slums was no gift either. Crowding poor drainage, rotting refuse, shared privies, and limited airflow could turn hot days into assaults. Rain meant mud, leaks, and bad drying conditions for laundry. Fog in industrial towns could mix with smoke into dense, dirty air that entered lungs and settled into curtains, clothes, and mood. To live ordinarily in Victorian Britain was to be on familiar terms with damp. One could almost list it among the household members. Religious and seasonal festivals nevertheless punctuated the year with meaning. Christmas grew warmer, more domestic, and more child-centered over the century, though the degree varied by class. Carols, cards, decorated greenery, plum pudding, modest gifts, church services, and family gatherings became more common. Easter, harvest festivals, fairs, wakes, bonfire traditions, and local saint or parish customs continued in various forms. May Day lingered in some places. Guy Fawkes Night brought noise and fire. These occasions mattered not merely as customs, but as emotional relief valves. They allowed feasting where there was usually frugality, sociability where there was usually fatigue, and memory where there was usually routine. A goose at Christmas or a special pudding was not just food. It was proof that the year had not completely beaten everyone into uniform misery. Queen Victoria herself hovered in the symbolic background of ordinary life in ways both significant and distant. Her reign provided the name for the era, and royal ceremonies, jubilees, weddings, births, deaths, and public appearances fed a growing culture of mass monarchy through newspapers, prints, souvenirs, and patriotic celebration. Ordinary people could feel genuine attachment to the crown while receiving very little direct improvement from it. Royal spectacle offered continuity, sentiment, and national identity. It also offered distraction. The monarchy functioned beautifully as a machine for making deprivation look ceremonial from a safe distance. Still, jubilees and royal occasions created communal events in towns and villages, with decorations, processions, tea treats for children, and local celebrations that people genuinely enjoyed. Human beings are perfectly capable of taking pleasure in symbols while still being underpaid. By the end of the 19th century, some aspects of life for ordinary Victorians had improved compared with earlier decades. Wages for some workers rose. Food became cheaper relative to income in certain periods. Public health had advanced. Education had expanded. Labor organization had grown. Housing reform, though incomplete, had at least become a matter of public discussion. Urban infrastructure was better in some places. Consumer goods were more available. Yet poverty remained widespread, inequality stark, and insecurity ever present. Slums had not vanished. Women remained constrained. Domestic service still dominated female employment. Casual labor still humiliated men at hiring gates. Old age still frightened the poor. Illness still destabilized families. And empire still provided national swagger, while the nation's ordinary backbone remained bent over work. So when we ask what life was like for ordinary Victorians, the most truthful answer is that it was dense, strenuous, improvised, communal, exhausting, morally surveilled, materially unstable, and much more human than the polished cliches suggest. It was not a tableau of stiff collars and moral certainty. It was a living world of bills, soot, sore feet, babies crying at inconvenient hours, women scrubbing steps, men lining up for work, children racing through alleys, clerks trying not to look poor, servants carrying coal scuttles at dawn, vendors shouting over cab wheels, families pawning blankets in bad weeks and redeeming them in better ones, laundresses burning their hands in tubs of hot water, seamstresses sewing beyond the edge of their sight, old people sitting close to the fire because they had earned at least that much, and everywhere the immense labor of continuing. Perhaps that is why the era still fascinates. Beneath the grand narratives of empire and industry is the quieter narrative of ordinary endurance, not heroic in the bronze statue way, heroic in the making tea anyway way, in the scrubbing, mending, saving, comforting, carrying, walking, lining up, reading by poor light, attending funerals, going back to work, trying to keep children alive, trying to keep respectability intact, trying to laugh on Saturday night, trying to rest on Sunday, trying to look toward Monday without visible despair. The Victorians built railways, factories, sewers, institutions, and myths about themselves. Ordinary Victorians built daily life out of less impressive materials: bread, coal, thread, wages, gossip, thrift, prayer, soup, debt, pride, and the odd half-hour of music when the week briefly loosened its grip. And if their age called itself modern, they were the ones paying for that modernity in installments no one ever finished repaying. So, as the lamps dim in our little journey through their world, and the last carts rattle away over wet stones, you can leave them there in the half-light, not as decorative figures in sepia, but as people whose lives were awkward, crowded, funny, harsh, tender, and stubbornly real, which, for a supposedly proper century, is almost indecently honest.